to the next point. We should ensure whatever we see is clear.
That means work is being done. We can see that it is in opposite direction.
Hello, learners and viewers out there. You are most welcome to yet another segment of e-learning. I'm Mrs. Asebede Vindagjana, your CRS teacher. Today, we are going to look at the topic, nature miracles. What did I say, my students? Yes, nature miracles. Now, if you look at it, naturally, there are a lot of things that happens. For example, the wind blows, my students. And when you see some trees nearby, you will see the leaves shaking. These are natural things that happen to us. In terms of hunger, nobody prays to be hungry. But when it comes, when you eat in the morning, automatically you have to create time to eat in the afternoon again, because you must definitely feel hungry. So Jesus, in his time and even now, has power over nature. Anything that happens to us naturally and is beyond our power, Jesus has the power to stop all those things. So today, let us look at nature miracles. What is a miracle? An Oxford Dictionary defines a miracle as a wonderful event occurring to supernatural powers. In the religious aspect, miracles are major aspects of the ministry of Jesus to meet human needs, both spiritual and physical, not as a mere display of his power. My students, Jesus was not performing these miracles for people to come and pay him, nor clap for him. Even kings, you remember when Jesus was tried before Herod? Herod was so excited to see Jesus perform some miracles before him because he had heard about him. But when Jesus appeared before Herod, he never performed a miracle because he was not performing these miracles to show people that yes, he has arrived, but he was doing this to meet his listeners' needs. Now, there are signs of God's special intervention in the human affairs. Jesus performed miracles over nature, which are called nature miracles, and they are stilling the storm, feeding of 5,000, feeding of the 4,000, and walking on the sea. These were miracles that Jesus performed when he was here on earth. And when you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, my students, you can do it. Now, when Jesus was on earth, he fed a lot of people. He showed his power over nature. And that is to tell you that he who created nature, there is nothing that can be beyond his power. So he showed his power over nature by solving the needs of his disciples who were affected naturally. Now, let us start with stilling the storm. Stilling the storm or stopping the storm, making the storm, that great wind, to stop. For example, my students, in a year when the rain is about to start, there used to be heavy storm or heavy wind, and it can even uproot some trees, unroof some houses, and can cause a lot of damages. In this situation, Jesus can stop it or can intervene. So even in his lifetime, if you read the book of Matthew chapter 8 from verse 23 to 27, Mark 4 from verse 35 to 41, Luke 8 from verse 22 to 25, you will see how Jesus stopped the storm. Now, after Jesus had taught the multitude a parable of the kingdom beside the sea, he decided to cross to the other side of the sea with his disciples. When they got into the boat, suddenly a wild storm or wind arose that put them in danger of being drowned. Now, my students, you can just imagine what I have just told us earlier, that when the rain is starting in a year, you find out that there used to be a very great wind blowing, and it used to cause a lot of damages. Now, you can imagine seeing these disciples in the sea. They were traveling through the sea, and look at the wind blowing, tossing their boat here and there. If you were there, my students, how will you feel? It was so terrifying. And so the disciples were thinking of being drowned. Their end has come. They were seeing their death. But as we go ahead, you will see how Jesus intervened. Now, at this time, Jesus was deep asleep in the boat, and the disciples alerted him, saying, and I quote, "Lord, save us, we are going to drown." The book of Luke quoted the disciples thus, and I quote again, "Teacher, do you not care if we perish?" Jesus got up and rebuked the wind by saying, "Peace, be still," and the wind stopped. You can imagine that, my student, just getting up and just talk to the wind as if the wind is a man. Jesus addressed the wind. And my students, you tend to see that Jesus was with his disciples in the boat, but he was there sleeping. So when the disciples found out that they were in trouble, there was no help from anywhere, and the person that would solve their problem was there with them. They quickly went and woke him up, and Jesus addressed their issue. So even in your life, there could be so many things disturbing you, my students. Your parents cannot solve them. Even the richest man in the world cannot solve them, because money is not everything. But if Jesus steps into your situation, that's all. So when Jesus rebuked the wind, the disciples themselves were surprised. Who is this man that even the wind could obey him, could listen to him, and their problem was solved? Now, let us go ahead, my students. Jesus, at this point, blamed his disciples for their lack of faith. He said, "Why are you afraid? Have you no faith?" The disciples were surprised at this and wondered what nature of man Jesus was, because even the wind and sea obeyed him. Now, Jesus expected his disciples to have used their faith to stop the wind, because they've been with him for a long time, and he expected them to use their faith and stop this wind. But my students, fear could not allow them. There are times in our situations we could be faced with so many things, and for you to even pray, you might not even have the peace of mind to do it. You might not even remember. So Jesus blamed his disciples. He wanted them to actually use their faith to stop the great wind that was actually troubling them, but they could not. But Jesus, in his mercy, stopped the wind and later addressed them. So my students, you can use your faith to pray for your parents, to pray for whoever that is sick, and you can imagine God will actually step into that situation. Now, let us look at another miracle that Jesus performed. Feeding of the 5,000. Not 5 men, not 50, but 5,000 men, my students. Now, if we look at the book of Matthew 14, from verse 13 to 24, Mark 6, from verse 30 to 44, and Luke 9, from verse 10 to 17. Now, if we look at these books, the book of Mark has it that when the 12 disciples had returned from their evangelical mission and had told Jesus how they carried it out, Jesus took them in a boat to a lonely place to to enable them rest. Now, my students, you remember the mission of the 12 disciples and the mission of the 70 disciples? Now, these disciples have been with Jesus Christ, and Jesus knew he was going to leave them and go back to heaven, to where the Father is. And so he wanted them to actually practicalize what they had seen him do, so that even if he happens to go away, they will continue with the gospel. So that was why he sent them in twos to go and preach the gospel and perform some miracles. So it was after the 12 disciples had performed or had carried out the mission Jesus gave them, they came back. And Jesus took them to the boat, and he wanted them to go to a lonely place and rest. But you find out that, my students, when the people, as at that time, when they hear about the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ, what happens? You see people running to have their needs physically and spiritually, so that they will not lose the opportunity. Now, even in our days today, when we have strong men of God that preach the truth and actually perform some miracles, you find out that when people hear about them, they will want to actually identify and actually get their needs met. So it wasn't a surprising thing that people were running after the Lord Jesus Christ whenever they hear of his presence. So when the people saw them, they ran ahead of them on foot and formed a great crowd. They ran to a particular place. Before Jesus reached there, they were already there. So the book of Luke has it that it was a town called Bethsaida. Jesus had compassion on them and began to teach and even perform some miracles of healing. When Jesus saw how these people have already gathered to see him, to listen to him, oh, he had compassion over them. He pitied them. And what did he do? He did not leave them like that. He taught and equally performed some miracles. Now, what happened? When the day was far spent, the disciples suggested that Jesus should send the crowd away so that they could go and buy something to eat. Jesus ordered the disciples to give the crowd what to eat, but they pointed out that it was not going to be possible for them to feed such a crowd. When Jesus further asked them what was available, they said that only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. 5,000 men, my students, were there gathered to hear from the Lord Jesus Christ. And they have heard from him. He had done some miracles. But the disciples felt, these people must have been feeling very, very hungry. So Jesus should just dismiss them. But Jesus, who knew what the people were passing through, wanted to actually do something. So he tested the disciples. What do you have? The disciples felt, we will need a lot of money to be able to buy fish and bread for these people. But that was not what Jesus meant. He knew there was something. He said, okay, bring whatever that is available. And they felt there was a small boy in the crowd whom the mother must have given him the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to carry along. When he feels hungry, he can eat. It was used to feed 5,000 men. Now, my students, if you happen to watch your televisions, you find out that the cartoon on the feeding of the 5,000 is so amazing. You see how Jesus raised the 5 loaves of bread up and fish, and God blessing it. Oh, it's so wonderful. You see how the loaves and the fish were increasing, and the people were looking amazed. We are so surprised. We are jubilating. Food has come. Now, the next thing was that Jesus commanded the disciples to make the people sit in groups of 50s. Then he took the bread and looked up to heaven, blessed it, broke it, and gave them to the disciples to share, and also the fish. The 5,000 men ate to their satisfaction, while 12 baskets full of bread and fish remained. You can imagine that, my students. Just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish Jesus used to feed 5,000 men. If not Jesus, who can do it? He has the power. He can just talk and things can happen. So If Jesus can pray to God the Father, then who are you not to pray to God, my students? You tend to see that prayer is very, very important. You should pray at all times. Intercede for one another, and God is there to what? To perform some miracles. Now, the next thing is the feeding of the 4,000. So I tend to see that, my students, you should not be confused. In the feeding of the 5,000, we have 12 full baskets as remnant. And you tend to see that at the end of it, Jesus asked his disciples to what? To pack the remaining fish and bread. So it is good that if you have enough, if you have 8, and you have some remaining, don't throw it away. There are people around you that need it. You can what? You can help or assist in that regard. Now, feeding of the 4,000 men. We look at the book of Matthew 15 from verse 32 to 39, Mark 8 from verse 1 to 9. The book of Matthew has it that after Jesus had cured the child of the Canaanite who was demon possessed, he went up to the mountain, and the crowd came to him with those of their relations for healing, and they were actually healed. There was no situation, my students, that was beyond the power of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, in the feeding of the 4,000, what happened? Now, the crowd stayed 3 days with Jesus without eating. You see, they were not fasting. But because they had the urge, the thirst to hear him and to see him perform miracles and to actually have their needs met physically and spiritually, they were always there. So Jesus felt that it was improper to send them hungry because they might faint on their way. The disciples reminded Jesus of the impossibility to get enough bread to feed the crowd in the wilderness. Remember, my students, they were not in the heart of the town. They were right there in the wilderness where there were no houses. So the disciples were wondering, how can they do it? But Jesus, in his power, had something to actually meet the needs of these people. So he felt it was not proper for him to just send them away. And with hunger, my students, supposing you are coming from school and you reach your house and nothing has been prepared as lunch, how do you feel? When you look at this situation of these people, they have spent good 3 days with the Lord Jesus Christ without eating. Not that they were fasting, but because of the urge and the thirst they had for him, they decided to just stay with him. But he, Jesus, who knew their minds, who knew their situation, had something for them. So, like in the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus asked the disciples how many loaves they had. They said 7 loaves and few small fish. He ordered the crowd to sit down, then he took the bread and fish and gave thanks to God, broke them and gave them to the disciples to serve the crowd. This time around, 4,000, my students. And if you look at the number, remember in the feeding of the 5,000, we had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But in the feeding of the 4,000, he had 7 loaves and few small fish. Then Jesus ordered the crowd, asked his disciples to order the crowd to sit down in groups, and he prayed. God blessed the fish and bread. He ordered the disciples to give to the crowd, and they ate to their satisfaction. And at the end of it, still, Jesus did not want them to waste the food. So what did he do? he told the disciples to gather the remnants. And when they did, my students, this time around, in the feeding of the 5,000, it was 12 baskets as remnants. But in the feeding of the 4,000, we have 7 full baskets. So the crowd ate to their satisfaction, and we had 7 baskets full of broken pieces of bread and fish. Now, in the next miracle, my students, walking on the sea. If you look at the book of Matthew 14, 22 to 26, and Mark 6, 45 to 52, after feeding the 4,000, Jesus commanded his disciples to enter the boat and cross to the other side of the sea. Jesus remained with the crowd to dismiss and later went to the mountain to pray. I've told you the importance of prayer, my students. Jesus was always praying to God the Father. So, now, the disciples were there. And you tend to see that, my students, if you happen to take a cup of water and touch your saliva and pick, just touch the ground, you find out that your saliva will carry some sand. If you sprinkle this sand in the cup of water, what will happen? You find out that the sand will sink into the water. But look at this one, Jesus walking on the sea. That was a miracle, my students. If a mother happens to give birth to a child today, and the child is up to 12 months or even 11 months and has not started standing up, not to even talk of walking, it becomes a problem in the family. So you tend to see that Jesus walked on the sea. So what happened? Later in the evening, there was a great storm, and their boat was almost about to capsize. While it was night, Jesus walked on the sea towards where the disciples were in the boat. And when they saw him coming, they were terrified, thinking they had seen a ghost. They immediately cried out, but Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Have no fear." Now, my students, Jesus, as he was walking on the sea, he had dismissed the 4,000 men and was approaching his disciples, but walking on the sea. He was not in the boat with them. He was walking on the sea. Now, it was evening time, and I know all of you, if you should happen to go near a river in the evening, you hear the frogs crying and all manner of nature, you tend to see that you'll be afraid. So what happened? The disciples were afraid, seeing Jesus walking on the sea. And what happened? They felt it was a ghost coming towards them. And so they didn't find it easy. They were so much afraid. And Jesus had to introduce himself to them that he was the one. Let them not be afraid. And tend to see that if you continue to read, when he talked to them in that manner, Peter said, "If you are the Lord, let me come to you." He said, "Oh yeah, come." When he started walking, he said, "My students, if you feel you have arrived, if care is not taken, you will fall." So Peter fell when he was walking on the sea and felt, yes, he was doing it. What happened? He started sinking, and he had to cry out for Jesus to what? To save him. So before I step down, my students, I have an assignment. And from all that we have learned, please remember we have discussed about natural miracles. What happens to us naturally? That is the storm, the wind blows, we feel hungry, you can walk, but all those things, Jesus used them to perform miracles, wonderful things that you as a human being cannot perform except he gives you the power. So, in our assignment, please, my student, if you are calling, after you might have been done with the assignment, please, when you are calling, identify where you are coming from and your name. So, question 1 says, list 4 miracles that Jesus performed under nature and explain any 2 of them. List 4 miracles that Jesus performed under nature and explain any 2 of them. 1B, state 2 lessons learned from nature miracles. I remain your CRS teacher, Mrs. Asebede Vindagjana. My contact number is 08077251542. Stay safe, keep learning till we meet in our next lesson.